Imagine waking up one morning, stepping outside, and discovering that nearly every major country on Earth is suddenly at war. In early 1914, that scenario seemed impossible. Europe appeared to be at the absolute height of its wealth, stability, and global power. Britain ruled the seas with a massive, unmatched naval fleet, while Germany's heavy industries were expanding at a remarkable pace. Looking to the east, this map highlights how the Russian Empire controlled a vast, sweeping landmass that stretched uninterrupted across two entire continents. France maintained a highly trained, formidable standing army, and Austria-Hungary governed millions of people across a complex web of different cultures and languages. These empires were more interconnected than any before them, linked by trade, shared royalty, and a century of relative stability. To the leaders of the time, the world seemed too modern and too prosperous for a general war to be a rational possibility. But beneath that peaceful surface, tension was quietly growing. Powerful nations constantly competed to claim overseas colonies and extract vital resources. To protect those interests, they built massive armies and poured enormous amounts of capital into producing new battleships and deadly weapons faster than ever before. At the same time, these nations sought security by dividing Europe into two heavily armed opposing defense pacts. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy linked themselves together right in the center of the continent to form the Triple Alliance. In response, Britain, France, and Russia formalized their own agreements, creating the Triple Entente, and effectively encircling the alliance powers. These treaties were intended to guarantee mutual protection and deter aggression. Instead, they wired the entire continent together, ensuring that any localized dispute would eventually drag every major power into the fight. That dispute arrived on June 28, 1914, in the regional valley city of Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, traveled there to inspect the military and ride in a public motorcade. Crowds lined the streets to watch him pass. Hidden among them was Gavrilo Princip, a young Serbian nationalist waiting for an opportunity. Following a wrong turn, the Archduke's car abruptly braked and stalled on the cobblestones, stopping just a few feet away from Princip. Princip seized his narrow window. He raised his pistol and fired two immediate shots, killing Franz Ferdinand and his wife. While political violence was a known risk in the Balkans, the structure of European power had changed. Because nations were now linked by rigid treaties and hypersensitive military timelines, this regional murder became a global emergency. Austria-Hungary immediately blamed the nation of Serbia for the assassination, and within weeks, diplomatic negotiations completely collapsed. Russia decided to honor its ties to Serbia and began rapidly mobilizing its massive infantry across the continent. As this flowchart of escalation shows, Germany viewed the Russian mobilization as a direct threat and formally declared war to protect Austria-Hungary. The diagram expands as France is immediately pulled into the conflict to honor its own defensive pact with Russia. Moving to outflank the French lines, Germany invaded the neutral country of Belgium, an action that forced Britain to formally declare war on Germany. In a matter of days, the complex system built to deter aggression failed entirely, rapidly dragging Europe into a massive and inescapable war. Millions of young men marched enthusiastically toward the front lines, proudly representing their respective nations. Soldiers and cheering civilians alike shared the tragic illusion that this conflict would be a grand, heroic adventure, decisively won and over in a few short months. Instead, these massive columns of infantry were walking blind into one of the deadliest conflicts the world had ever seen. The fighting ground on for more than 4 agonizing years, ruthlessly destroying entire generations of young men. The artillery fire and social collapse broke 4 historic empires, dissolving centuries-old borders and forcing the map of the world to be redrawn from scratch. The illusion of European stability died abruptly in the summer of 1914, replaced by relentless, mechanized slaughter. In Part 2, these marching soldiers will face the harsh realities of stagnant trench warfare, the suppressing fire of heavy machine guns, and the agonizing introduction of poison gas. Before 1914, Europe appeared to be at the absolute height of its global influence. Britain ruled the seas, Germany's industrial output was expanding rapidly, and vast empires spanning multiple continents projected an image of total stability. But beneath that peaceful surface, tension was quietly compounding. Powerful nations were actively competing for overseas colonies, while simultaneously expanding their standing armies and building deadly new weapons faster than ever before. This map shows how the continent was divided into two massive protection pacts. On one side was the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, and on the other, the Triple Entente, linking Britain, France, and Russia. These alliances were publicly justified as diplomatic shields to deter conflict. In reality, they wired the nations together so tightly that a single local dispute would inevitably trigger a continent-wide military response. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, traveled to the city of Sarajevo. As his motorcade passed through the crowded streets, the Archduke's car unexpectedly stalled, leaving him completely stationary just feet from the watching crowd. Standing among them was a young Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. Recognizing the opportunity, he stepped forward and fired 2 shots. Those 2 bullets bypassed every diplomatic negotiation in Europe. Almost overnight, the complex system of treaties engaged, pulling one nation after another into the dispute. Austria-Hungary immediately blamed Serbia for the assassination. The diplomatic channels broke down in days, replaced by a rigid chain reaction of automated war declarations. This timeline tracks the collapse. Russia mobilized to protect Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia to support Austria. France entered the conflict to back Russia, and when Germany invaded Belgium, Britain declared war on Germany. Within days, a massive logistical operation was underway. Millions of young men packed into military trains, leaving their civilian lives behind as they deployed toward the expanding borders. Among these marching ranks, the prevailing belief was that the conflict would be resolved quickly. They marched with the confidence that they would return home within a few months. But the speed of the deployment masked a critical oversight. The military leadership of Europe was sending its forces into an industrialized conflict that their traditional tactics were completely unprepared to handle. As the armies finally clashed, generals continued to order 19th-century open-field charges. They were immediately met by the devastating reality of 20th-century mechanized technology. Faster, intense tone. New machine guns fired hundreds of rounds every single minute, creating a wall of lead that instantly suppressed any forward movement. Behind the lines, heavy industrial artillery pieces could drop explosive shells onto exact coordinates from miles away, destroying entire villages without ever seeing the enemy. When ordered into the open field, men found themselves completely exposed. Entire battalions advancing across the ground were systematically cut down in seconds. This concentration of firepower instantly eradicated the possibility of a mobile victory. To survive the onslaught, both sides had only one option left: to start digging. The result was the Western Front. It was a continuous scar of mud and defensive trenches stretching hundreds of miles, from the coast of the English Channel all the way down to the Swiss border. This aerial view shows the complex web-like structure of the trench systems, engineered to halt forward advancement. Between the opposing British and German lines lay a deadly, open terrain known as No Man's Land, a barren void separating 2 military empires. Life down inside the earth was horrific. The men lived constantly exposed to the elements, trapped between narrow walls in knee-deep mud, where disease spread rapidly, and rats fed on the scarce food supplies. By burying themselves underground, the armies created a perfect tactical stalemate. The defensive advantage was so extreme that it practically guaranteed neither side could push forward. Yet military commanders continually ordered their troops out of the trenches. Thousands were repeatedly sent charging into a deadly maze of shell craters and thick barbed wire. To break the deadlock, the conflict introduced even more terrifying methods. In 1915, clouds of chlorine gas were released, drifting heavily across the battlefield into enemy trenches. With soldiers unable to breathe and dying where they stood, rudimentary gas masks quickly became a permanent, daily necessity just to survive on the front lines. The stagnation reached its most brutal peak in 1916. During the 10-month Battle of Verdun, combined casualties exceeded 700,000. At the Somme, the British Army lost nearly 60,000 men in a single day. Despite millions of artillery shells fired and entire forests destroyed, the geographic lines dividing Europe barely moved an inch. The leaders who promised a swift victory had trapped a generation in a stationary meat grinder. The deadlock was absolute, forcing the war to rely on desperate new technologies, like tanks, and eventually the intervention of a rising superpower. By 1914, Europe's major powers dominated the globe. Britain's navy controlled the major trade routes, German steel production was overtaking its neighbors, and a century of relative stability gave the continent a sense of permanent security. But beneath that quiet surface, a massive arms race was underway. Competing empires were quietly funneling their growing wealth into expanding their armies and stockpiling new, highly efficient weapons faster than ever before. To manage tensions, Europe divided into two heavily armed camps. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy formed the Triple Alliance. Britain, France, and Russia formed the Triple Entente. These mutual protection treaties functioned as deterrents, making the cost of conflict so high no nation would dare start a fight. These rigid defensive pacts functioned as a continental tripwire. By interlocking the fate of every major capital, the system guaranteed that any localized border clash would pull the entire continent into a total war. That trap was triggered on June 28, 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, traveled to the city of Sarajevo. When his motorcade unexpectedly stalled in the street, a young Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip saw an opportunity, stepped forward, and fired 2 shots. Within moments, the Archduke and his wife were dead. Austria-Hungary immediately blamed Serbia, and diplomatic negotiations rapidly collapsed. Because of those binding treaties, one declaration of war triggered another. Russia mobilized. Germany declared war on Russia and France. When German troops invaded Belgium, Britain joined the fray. In days, the system detonated. Millions of young men packed their gear and marched toward the front lines, carrying with them a collective illusion. Both the public and military leadership genuinely believed this conflict would be a grand, heroic adventure that would be over in a few short months. This outdated, romantic worldview blinded an entire generation to the terrifying reality they were actually walking into, an industrialized slaughterhouse. As these armies advanced across Europe, they tried to use traditional battlefield tactics, infantry charging bravely across open fields. But modern technology instantly rendered those tactics suicidal. The men were charging into weapons of horrifying efficiency. Machine guns could fire hundreds of rounds every minute, while mass-produced heavy artillery could obliterate entire villages from miles away. Soldiers caught in the open were cut down in seconds. To survive this relentless bombardment, the surviving troops had no choice but to dig deep into the earth. This map shows the Western Front. It was a massive, continuous network of opposing defensive trenches that eventually divided Europe, stretching all the way from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Living in these trenches was psychological torture. Men endured day and night of exploding artillery shells, severe lack of sleep, and standing in knee-deep, rat-infested mud. Massive industrial firepower had broken the very concept of a decisive victory. Strategic movement ground to a halt, replaced by a terrifying, static deadlock. Between the opposing lines lay no man's land, a deadly expanse of tangled barbed wire and flooded shell craters. Merely attempting to cross this open ground meant almost certain death. In 1915, the terror escalated. Armies unleashed poison gas on a massive scale, sending thick clouds of chlorine drifting directly into enemy trenches. Surviving this new chemical environment required every soldier to adapt. Bulky, alien-looking gas masks quickly became essential equipment for every man on the line. This chart illustrates the sheer futility of the major offensives. During the 10-month Battle of Verdun in 1916, French and German forces suffered over 700,000 casualties, yet the line marking territorial gain barely moves. At nearly the same time, the Battle of the Somme unfolded. On the very first day of that offensive, the British Army alone suffered nearly 60,000 casualties. By the end of 1916, millions of men had died for mere yards of ruined mud. Military commanders, relying on outdated strategies, were completely paralyzed by the lethal rules of modern warfare. By 1917, the weight of the war was crushing Europe. Severe food shortages and failing economies caused civilian morale to plummet, and a deep exhaustion settled over the surviving nations. The pressure finally cracked the Russian Empire. Revolution erupted in the streets, toppling the government and abruptly pulling Russia completely out of the conflict. Desperate to win before they collapsed, Germany tried to break the British naval blockade by unleashing a campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare across the Atlantic. But sinking ships carrying American civilians, combined with the discovery of a secret telegram encouraging Mexico to attack the United States, forced President Woodrow Wilson to act. In April, America officially declared war. By 1917, the struggle had expanded across the Atlantic. With the United States involved, the conflict became a contest of total industrial endurance, where victory belonged to whichever side could survive a war of attrition on a global scale. Fresh American troops and vast industrial supplies began pouring into Europe, alongside powerful new technologies like the armored tank, which finally allowed forces to crush through barbed wire and safely cross no man's land. Germany launched one final, massive spring offensive to break the lines, but they could not maintain the advance. The Allies countered with the 100 Days Offensive, steadily pushing back a starving and depleted German military until its morale completely collapsed. Finally, on November 11, 1918, an armistice took effect. After more than 4 years of relentless, deafening destruction, the guns across Europe fell silent. The cost of the war was staggering. More than 20 million people were dead. The map of the world was completely redrawn as 4 mighty institutions, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires, shattered into pieces. In 1919, world leaders gathered in France to sign the Treaty of Versailles. The agreement forced Germany to accept total responsibility for the war, strip away its military, and pay crushing economic reparations. These terms forced Germany to surrender its territory and begin paying enormous reparations that its shattered economy could not support. For many Germans, this was a dictated peace, a source of deep humiliation and economic hardship that radicalized the public and provided the fuel for Adolf Hitler's eventual rise. The guns had fallen silent, but the specific terms of the settlement ensured the conflict would eventually resume on a much larger scale.